In the shadow of Troskowitz Castle sits the village of Troskowitz. It's a glorious place surrounded by greenery and seemingly endless meadows of life. The people, however, as you would expect from a rural medieval community, are an insular sort, or at least at first they are. Come the day's end, coin is coin. But they aren't the like to fall over themselves welcoming newcomers. Like anyone, they can be won over with consistent positive action. But as we discover the hard way, their default disposition towards strangers is suspicion. However, did you know that there might be a killer in their midst? For a stone's throw from the village discarded in a bush, we can find the brutally murdered remains of a man. If the flute jammed into his ear is any indication, he was a musician. A flautist, to be exact. But who would do this, and why? Who killed the flautist? To find our fallen flute-playing friend, we have ourselves a reasonably easy task. The murdered flautist can be found just north of Troskowitz. It's barely even a walk in the grand scheme of things, and what will meet us are the remains of a man who clearly did not die of natural causes. The body is decomposing, and the ground beneath him is saturated in blood. Most curiously, in his ear, we can see a flute. Somebody has jammed that in there with some serious force. It's clear this man died violently.
Oh God, he looks terrible. Why does he have a flute in his ear?
An inspection of his pockets reveals the man is still in possession of his money, implying he wasn't killed for coin, immediately eliminating the prospect that bandits might be behind this killing. As for how this poor chap died, the flute in this man's ear appears to be the least of his worries, for he also appears to have bled heavily from his abdomen, and a blood trail leads back to the road, where the real murder weapon is revealed to be a bog-standard work axe. Which makes sense, they are readily available, and when directed with force towards a person can cause catastrophic damage. The flute in his ear therefore likely did not contribute towards the musician's death. It would seem this man was murdered on the road and then dragged out of the way, where the flute would then be jammed into his lifeless ear. It would seem this has a more symbolic meaning. Perhaps somebody wasn't fond of his music. The flute to the ear appears to be a physical representation of the abrasiveness of this particular musician's music. It may be an extreme reaction, but it gives us some clarity on why this man was murdered. He was annoying. This means that his killer and he likely overlapped in life, bringing the focus to Troskowitz. Because where better for a medieval musician to ply their trade than the local tavern? After all, it's the social hub of any village, town or city. It's where people gather to drink and get merry, to cast off the day's work and enjoy themselves, engaging in increasingly drunken conversations. The tasteful presence of music can enhance that experience, but interestingly, more often than not, the tavern in Troskowitz doesn't have much in the way of music going on. There is a musician present, but he's very conservative with his performances. The only time we actually see him play is during a brief segment during the quest Laboratories, while we lug sacks from this cart outside to the inn's pantry to pay for our meal. Beyond that, the musician who is labelled as such just kind of hangs about, as if it's somehow understood that it's better to play too little than too much. It strikes me as weird the Troskowitz Tavern has a musician reluctant to do his job, instead for the most part functioning as an ordinary punter. However, if we bring news of the discovery of the flautist's corpse to the bailiff, despite belonging to no marked quest, he will possess dialogue confirming what we can already gather.
I found a dead body outside of town.
Another corpse, just what I needed. This region must be cursed!
He's laying there among the trees, past the field beneath Troskowitz. It looks like he's been there a while. But the worst part is, he has a flute stuck in his ear.
That must be the musician who went missing. Can't say I'm surprised. This musician used to play at the tavern. He played nicely, but for too long, and it started getting on people's nerves.
What are we going to do with him now?
I'll have him buried at least. And here, this is for reporting it.
We'll receive a nice 70 groschen for our troubles. As for the interaction, I find that interesting for a number of reasons. Firstly, the bailiff does have an explanation for how this guy met his end. The conclusion we arrive at is that it was in fact the misdeed of a villager here in Troskowitz. That being said, Bailiff Thrush isn't exactly concerned with getting to the bottom of it. Not necessarily the reaction you would expect in alerting him to the presence of a murderer in his village. Thrush seems to be of the belief that the best course of action is to bury the poor fellow and put it behind them. And sure enough, if we later return to the grisly site, the body has been removed. To where? I have absolutely no earthly idea. We'll get more onto that in a bit, but the second thing that interests me about Thrush's dialogue is that the musician is left unnamed, which to me implies that the victim was an outsider, not a local. He came here to play his tunes, not set down roots, and as we know from our own tasty experience, this is not the most welcoming place for an outsider to be. Third, the reasoning Thrush provides for why he's not surprised the musician was murdered is that his flute playing was incessant. A rationale he frames in a way that could only arise from one perspective. Agreement. The fourth thing that interests me is the lack of surprise itself. You may agree that the overindulgence in the flute is annoying, but would you not find that to be an alarmingly petty reason to slaughter a man? I'm sure there's a reasonable explanation for all of it, but for the time being I'm just making notes. To circle back to the topic of the musician's burial, the thing I find to be most interesting is the body disappears, but then finding the grave poses some challenge. The place one would naturally think to look is the cemetery, but nothing really happens here. No new graves sprout. You might easily argue this consecrated ground is reserved for the actual residents of Troskowitz, of which we've gathered the unnamed musician likely wasn't. At the same time, where else are you going to respectfully put a corpse? So that within itself is a modest mystery to gnaw on, although it could just be a symptom of how the game is made, and we're not really meant to look that deep into it. But where's the fun in that? For now though, the burning question is who among Troskowitz locals could have done this? In that respect, our greatest clue is perhaps a misfire. The work axe that was used to chop the poor soul to death is perhaps the most abundant tool in the entire village. Throw a stone and you'll hit multiple. The murder weapon is the usable weapon variant, so it is slightly different. Nevertheless, it's typical and generic for its like, and more or less everybody in Troskowitz has a reason for owning an axe of this variety. It is a ubiquitous tool in village life. The possession of an axe is neither difficult for the average bumpkin, nor would it necessarily raise any eyebrows. In other words, it could be the perfect disposable utility for committing a murder. If anything, it speaks to the calculated nature of the killing. It may seem emotionally charged and irrational, but at the same time, whoever is behind this appears to have gotten away with it, and that isn't an easy thing for a peasant in an insular medieval community. It is true that forensics at the time were crude. It's also true that superstition had a tendency to stain facts. But these communities were highly insular. People would go their entire lives living within a 5-mile radius. Everyone would know everyone. If somebody disappeared one day, the disappearance would be reported. From there, figuring out who saw that individual last would, in many instances of murder, bring you directly to the killer. In failing that, public opinion more often than not would believe so. Before we get bogged down in the details of the legal processes of medieval Bohemia, it's apparent the cycle of investigation is broken before it even begun. What I mean is, nobody's really bothered the musician went missing to begin with. He was an outsider. From that we can gather he had no real connections here. When he vanished, it would only be notable because nobody can hear his annoying music, but in that setup it would be reasonable to assume he simply moved on. So a man nobody in the area is going to miss is murdered with a tool commonly found, and therefore is unlikely to be traced back to anyone in particular, and nobody knows anything about it because there's nothing to know. As grotesque as the flute jammed into the ear is, it's a very creative expression, and whoever killed him did not flee the scene straight away, instead dragging his body deeper into the bushes to convert the artist into something of a work of art. Furthermore, upon the body's discovery, the bailiff isn't remotely enthusiastic about getting to the bottom of who put this guy down, so on the basis of conjecture we're looking for somebody coordinated. A number of factors go into this. The bailiff is a very busy man. Allocating resources to getting to the bottom of a murder of a stranger may seem like the right thing to do, but he's balancing the interests of his village and his lord Otto von Berghoff. He puts this into words himself. With bandits roaming the area, the appearance of yet another corpse is not necessarily a surprise to him. At the same time, it's something he could do without. This is certainly no big secret. So even in the event the body is discovered, the chances that he's going to get to the bottom of that particular killing are low when corpses are turning up left, right and centre anyway. The man's got bigger fish to fry, and unravelling this mystery is not going to be popular with the people. And then to cap it off, the murder weapon is a tool that could theoretically be owned and wielded by anyone. This murder feels engineered to give us very little to go off. Then it hit me, this murder took place only a stone's throw from the village, and axes are not exactly elegant weapons. They can be wielded spectacularly, but it wouldn't be the safest bet for mitigating the risk of witnesses when a kill needs to be both swift and quiet. Unless you properly knew how to wield one, and that's not training that your average peasant gets. It could be a stroke of luck, of course that's possible. You don't explicitly need training with an axe to kill a man. All you need to do is swing it in his general direction and it'll do all the work for you. That being said, everything else about this murder seems specifically done to make investigating it unappealing. Hacking a bloke to death in the woods with a ubiquitous tool is one such layer of that, but getting away with it implies that nobody heard or saw anything, meaning the use of the axe was swift, precise and quiet. Like with any other weapon, that would require significant skill. Interestingly, the preferred weapon of many a guard here in Troskowitz appears to be the axe, and these guards would at least be proficient with wielding one. Not just because they might be expected to, but they're not your average village watch. Otto von Berghoff was a highly influential lord at this point in history, and these guards sport his colours and banner. They are trained retainers. Not only would a guard know how to wield an axe, they'd also know patrol patterns, meaning they'd know where and when to pounce. And in the event one is compelled to do so, they're equipped with the knowledge to do so effectively. As for the axe itself, the work axe might seem like a common tool. It's definitely intended to come across as one, but only a small portion of vendors in the game reliably sell them, and one of them is here in Troskowitz. The local carpenter, who also happens to be hanging on to a lute a bloke from Kuttenberg brought for repairs, but hasn't come to collect. We learned this during the side quest Troubadours, when we helped two musicians named George and Michael, whose names change depending on the language setting, as something of a series of regional references. What they want from us is for us to help them acquire this lute, and if we convince the carpenter's father to sell it to us, Henry's rationale is somewhat convincing.
That Kuttenberger won't be coming back for it anytime soon, though. Look, either he didn't have any coin, or someone did him in on the way. Why else would he leave such a fine instrument here?
You can't argue with the logic when we're investigating the doing in of a musician. What's interesting about this is it means the carpenter likely knows a thing or two about music. To repair a lute would at least necessitate some understanding of how the thing works. Not just how it produces sound, but how it should sound. At least insofar as being able to fix it up. But it's surely unlikely that's where the knowledge stops. A man came all the way from Kuttenberg for him to repair it. It's only a few dozen miles away, but by 15th century Bohemian standards, that's quite the mooch. So we have a presumably musically knowledgeable carpenter who sells a type of axe somebody used in a murder of a musician in his village, who just so happens to be repairing the instrument of a presumed musician from Kuttenberg, who is implied to have fallen off the face of the earth. So that's interesting. You'd also expect an itinerant musician to maybe be carrying more than one instrument. The Flautist, as the game calls him, only really has the flute. You would naturally expect a more complete setup than this, but hey, maybe this is one of the reasons why people found him annoying. He only had the flute, he only played the flute. At the same time, if we strip back our assumptions about the carpenter, it's interesting that a Kuttenberger would bring his lute all the way to a small village near Troskowitz Castle just for it to be repaired there. Surely there are many carpenters along the way. In a big city like Kutna-Hora, you would expect at least somebody present within the walls who could repair a lute. So either the carpenter here is renowned for repairing musical instruments, or the loose Kuttenberger explanation is just a cover, disguising how the carpenter truly got a hold of this fine instrument. What I'm getting at is, could the lute actually belong to the flute player who we find murdered at the roadside just outside Troskowitz with his flute jammed in his ear? The carpenter repaired the lute, so it would make sense if it was damaged in some kind of scuffle. At the same time, thanks to this layout, we know they break easily.
Oh, Anna has tiny tits, like a pair of cherry pits. Uh-oh.
Christ! No!
The idiot broke the strings!
So we definitely don't need a dramatic explanation for how the lute came to need repairing, but I decided to go poking around the carpenter's anyway, gaining access to the deeper portions of his house using this attractive window. Of course, he didn't consent to this, so we'll have to make it quick, and if it comes to it, look like a robbery. Anyway, I did find something interesting in my snooping. And not just that whoever initially decided to furnish windows with glass was onto something. You see, this house has an accessible attic, and up here we can find a locked chest. In this chest we can find some money and preserved supplies, but also a very ordinary coat and simple hood. As modelled by good old Henry here, you can see they are of the inconspicuous variety, even coming with a profound reductive effect on the conspicuousness stat. The attic is a peculiar place to store your clothes. It doesn't seem like the ordinary place for them, as there are no boots, no pants, only a dark coloured coat and inconspicuous hood that could just as easily be a fashion choice, but would also be ideal for skulking in the shadows at night. It's eyebrow raising even if those articles of clothing are entirely innocent. Then we actually do have this window. The fact that it sits above a low-roofed wooden structure means it's incredibly easy to climb into and out of, bypassing the front door altogether. It may have a practical use, but the flaw in the building's security is relatively apparent. The only reason one might leave this unaddressed would be because it's somewhat useful. So it's possible that somebody likes to use this window to creep out, and then creep back in. But this is starting to sound overcomplicated for a spur-of-the-moment murder. If you return at night, the chest is more full, housing the clothing and items of the hired hands who sleep up here. As for downstairs, the carpenter sleeps on the ground floor, and the carpenter's father sleeps in the room with the window. In total, there are 5 people occupying this abode at night. The idea that somebody is slipping out unnoticed just seems unlikely. It's still a possibility, mind you, and the idea of the assailant acting alone is unverified. But as far as the carpenter connection is concerned, that's where things dry up. To move on, interestingly, the Flautist is not the only murdered musician in the area. To find a second one, we won't have to travel very far at all. To the northwest of Troskowitz we can find the village of Takov. To the south of Takov, along the road back to Troskowitz, we can find a burnt down camp, complete with not one but 2 charred loots. And that's the second most interesting thing we can discover here. We can find a dead body in a well done state, situated atop a pile of ash. Much like the other musician, he has a flute coming out of some variety of indistinguishable orifice from his head, and also a horn rammed into his you-know-what. Both the flute and horn are intact, unlike the individual's burnt remains, suggesting they were placed there after death. Now, I can't tell if this is related to our other departed friend, however, the first musician's remains can be found here, and the second musician's are only here. That is not far at all. There's no way to put this nicely, but it's interesting to me that 2 musicians are found dead with things inserted into them so close together. Also, there are 2 lutes here. What kind of musician would carry multiple lutes while travelling? That would be horribly impractical on foot. So my theory is this guy had a friend, but his friend is nowhere to be seen. So that brings me back around to the locations where we find both sets of remains. Our flautist friend was murdered outside the village where he played, along a pathway that can lead in the general direction of Takov. And this geezer is a fellow musician in a camp that appears to be for 2 people. The reasoning for camping makes sense. It's more inexpensive than staying at an inn. What I'm getting at is I wouldn't be surprised if the murdered flautist was killed on his way back to that camp, which if true would increase the likelihood that these 2 killings are connected. However, this site also provides us with a reasonably unlocal hint. I am of course talking about the horn protruding from the man's backside. It reminded me of something situated just outside the city walls in Kuttenberg. The sign for the Hole-in-the-Wall Tavern, featuring, rather amazingly, an arse playing the trumpet. The Hole-in-the-Wall is a place of ill repute. What else can you expect from a place where inside a skeleton is just vibing on a chair? Anyway, the question becomes, why would a murder site just outside of Troskowitz have anything to do with the seedy 15th century dive bar in the city of Kuttenberg? Unfortunately, that's a question I'm unable to answer. The best explanation I can give is that both are references to medieval artwork portraying somebody playing a trumpet with their rump, and that may very well be where the connection ends. As for other things of note around Kuttenberg that might be relevant here, we of course have one of the discoveries possible in the Sedlets Monastery Cemetery. That is, if you fancy grave digging. North of the ossuary we can find what appears to be a mass grave and dig it up to reveal it's only the one grave. In the grave we can find a whistle tune, 2 flute songs, and a flute, along with a cracked skull which may or may not indicate that the man, presumably a flute player, met a grim end. I've seen it suggested that this is the grave of the flautist post-discovery, but I don't believe that's the case. I believe this for 2 reasons. Firstly, if we can loot bones, the person here has been dead for a good while, and by that I mean years. Secondly, the transportation of remains is expensive. Itinerant musicians were seldom wealthy. If they died somewhere away from home, they were likely to be buried locally, and nobody's necessarily going to sponsor their voyage home when it's possible that nobody knows where their home is. So, the musician we can find here is somebody else. Although the popular flute song we can loot here begins with Underneath the Oak Tree in the Tavern on the Square, which does make me think of the Troskowitz Tavern, which sits on the village square sheltered by an oak tree. But in this respect, as far as medieval taverns are concerned, I don't believe it's special. Of course the boozer would be an epicenter for the community, and why wouldn't it be shaded by an oak tree? So yeah, that song could theoretically reference anywhere. Simply put, I don't think we're going to find any answers this far from Troskowitz. That being said, we are left with 2 tenuous links to Kuttenberg, the butt trumpet in the Hole-in-the-Wall Tavern, and of course, the carpenter's mysterious Kuttenberger client, leaving behind a loot for repairs and then vanishing into thin air. Something about that story, though, just doesn't add up for me. That being said, it doesn't necessarily have to. Occam's razor is a beautiful thing. the Kuttenberger just happened to be in the area. It may be less about the carpenter's reputation repairing lutes, and more the fact that the carpenter was simply right there. It doesn't explain why he disappeared without his loot and never came back, but it's not implausible to take it at face value. So let's round things up to what we can gather. The attack on the flute player was likely a premeditated attack that took place at night. We know this because Troskowitz is a rural village. Its fields are for agriculture. During the day, there would be too many witnesses. In failing that, there would at least be a witness. At night, all you'd need is the bearing of guard patrol patterns and your groovy, suggesting the killer was a local. They likely had a bearing of the musician's routine, heading back to camp in the late to small hours after performing at the tavern all evening. To mitigate commotion, the attack had to be rapid and unexpected, meaning it's likely the flautist didn't see the axe coming until it was embedded in his gut. Once dead, the man was dragged into the bushes where the flute was jammed into his ear as a testament to the irritation he caused with it, and then the bloodied axe was discarded at the scene. As for the other victim, his potential travelling companion, as itinerant musicians, he was likely the only person in the area who would legitimately report his friend missing, making him a loose end. Without him championing a legitimate investigation, any discovery of the other musician would just be another corpse, and vice versa. At the same time, his corpse has been violated in a vaguely similar way. Medieval bards are often portrayed in fiction as exuberant and perhaps a bit pretentious. Perhaps this chap had fostered a reputation for tooting his own horn. Or we could be looking at some classic misdirection. But to regain focus, the axe that slaughtered the flautist being discarded on the road suggests it maybe came from somewhere where it would be viewed as disposable. For an axe to go missing and not be noticed, there would need to be a lot of them. You would think a medieval carpenter would have many, and the one in Troskowitz sells the exact axe used in the killing. As for who would find themselves annoyed by the guy as to be compelled to murder him, I'd imagine you're looking for somebody who spends an awful lot of time at the tavern. Nobody's quite as chronically at the tavern outside of working hours as a hired hand, an unmarried labourer, with nothing better to spend their coin on. And the Troskowitz carpenter houses two of those, and one of them keeps a dark, nondescript jacket and hood in a chest in the attic that they don't seem to wear, sleeping a short creep away from a window that seems designed for sneaking in through and out of. There's nothing concrete, unfortunately, but somebody in Troskowitz did this guy in, and it seems logical to look where that axe more than likely came from. Sure enough, one of the carpenter's hired hands wears an axe on his hip, and doesn't really use it for chopping anything. Unfortunately though, that's as far as this goes. Somebody in Troskowitz knows what happened, but we aren't truly equipped to get to the bottom of it. But worry not, there is another explanation. For Mr. Flute here is also an Easter egg, it would seem. My research briefly brought me to Reddit, where I found a post by designer suspect 147 discussing the story behind the butt trumpet guy. In the responses I found a comment by Dr. Fusselpully, which as it turns out is the online handle for Christian Piontek, Warhorse Studios' community manager, who claims that during development there was initially way more flute playing going on in the game's opening, much to the extreme annoyance of those who playtested it. So they decided to create an Easter egg where the musician was dead with the flute jammed in his ear, as something of an act of revenge from beyond the fourth wall. And the charred corpse in the camp with the horn in his rump was a nod to the hole-in-the-wall tavern, which I suppose explains a lot. These murders are so confounding because they've been contrived as Easter eggs. Nevertheless, I enjoyed allocating some time to sniffing around Troskowitz and trying to wrap my head around it. But for everybody's sanity, I'm going to end this video here. So, I thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed. If you did, be sure to go ahead, leave a like, subscribe, share the channel with your friends, all that wonderful stuff. It would be massively appreciated. And of course, let me know what you think down in the comments. Could a hired hand be behind this? Maybe one of the guards? Or perhaps you have an altogether different theory. If you fancy joining our Discord server, be sure to do so via the QR code on screen now. If you can put up with my rambling for any length of time, you are more than welcome. And with any luck, I'll be seeing you all very soon with another video at some point, but until next time, please take care, and goodbye.